Hello, I'm John Speeton, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Family and Life Academy and to the fifth of our 6-lesson course on abortion. This course involves 3 teachers, Dr Greg Pike, Dr Anne Farmer, and myself. And tonight it's Dr Pike's turn, and his lesson is entitled Abortion and Women's Health, and it focuses in particular on the physical and psychological impact of abortion on the basis of rigorous peer-reviewed published research. Dr Gregory Pike is the director of the Adelaide Centre for Bioethics and Culture in Australia and senior research fellow at the BIOS Centre in London. He's served on several government consultative committees and also on the Australian Health Ethics Committee, a principal committee of the federal government's National Health and Medical Research Council. At the end of the lesson, Dr. Pike will answer any questions you may have, which you can put in the chat window at any time during the lesson. And I will now hand over the stage to Dr. Pike.
Thank you, John. In this lesson, as John said, we'll be looking at the impact of abortion on women, and we'll be looking at a lot of the evidence. But before we get into that, I just wanted to note briefly that the impact of abortion does actually go beyond a direct impact on women. And it's fair to say that there is also an impact on men and family members, and I think particularly on the medical community that has engaged in abortion. So there's quite a spread of effect. But let's get into the evidence. But the first thing to say is that there are a couple of reasons why this is a difficult area of research. And as many will be aware, there's a lot of public debate, quite hotly debated, and dispute about the types of things we're going to talk about today. And a certain amount of debate and dispute is correct and right, but sometimes it goes beyond. But what are those 2 primary reasons? Well, the first is that this is difficult research to do. Abortion is often poorly reported, and you can't always link it up with the outcomes so easily. And if you were to do a survey, for example, there's quite a bit of survey work done on the reasons why women choose abortion and things like that. But women who are often badly affected avoid participation in that sort of research. So it's hard to get a really representative sample. So number 1, the research can be difficult to do. But number 2 is that there are large forces at work, some ideological and political forces that can influence how research is actually done. That can be by way of funding, who gets funded, what work gets funded, and then the studies themselves can sometimes be of highly variable quality. And it's my view that some studies are actually, the researchers set out with a particular predetermined goal, which is certainly not the way that research should be done. So one of the major studies which has been quite problematic in this field, which is about women's psychological health, is termed the Turnaway study. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail later on in the lecture and unpackage some of the problems in it. It's been hugely influential, and it's been influential not only because it's generated an enormous number of papers, published papers, but also because the particular findings they came up with were taken up by the media avidly and published widely to the effect that there was no effect of abortion on a woman's psychological health, which enormous other body of research had already established there was an effect. So we're going to look at the physical effects first before we get to the psychological effects. And Again, many people will be aware that there's been a shift over the last 10 to 15 years away from surgical abortions, vacuum aspiration abortions, as we discussed in one of the earlier lectures, towards what is termed early medical abortion. Now, I personally don't like the term because I think medical is all about healing, and this is clearly not about healing. So I prefer the term chemical abortion or drug-induced abortion. But because this is commonly used, we're to a certain extent stuck with it. So what are the physical effects, the immediate physical effects that a woman will experience? This work comes from the 3 major clinical trials which were conducted before the drug RU486 became available. And these are the sorts of things which women experienced. High levels of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, pain, fever, chills, headache, dizziness, and weakness. It's a very unpleasant set of outcomes. And in one particular study, 62% of the women said that they experienced pain they described as severe. So these are what you might call the immediate effects of the abortion experience. Then we can go beyond those immediate, what you might call side effects, and look at complications. And there are kind of 3 main complications that can happen. One is hemorrhage or bleeding, excessive bleeding. Another is infection. Another is what's called an incomplete abortion. So as far as hemorrhage goes, some of the studies have come up with a figure about 0.6%. It's worth keeping in mind that whilst this percentage is relatively small, 0.6, because this is such a common procedure, we're talking about thousands and thousands of women affected. So and that's hemorrhage. That's not excessive bleeding or the bleeding that is normally part of the process, because that's really how it works. The process works by bleeding. One particular Finnish study found that 15.6% of women sought hospital care for bleeding after their medical abortion. That's quite a high figure. I mentioned the risk of infection, and this is where things can get serious. And in fact, early on in the use of RU486, there were some deaths in the US. There may well be more deaths than we are aware of because of reporting problems. I mentioned that a medical abortion can be in what's called incomplete. The figures are around 5 to 10%. And what that means is a woman will find that she is still retaining the unborn child's remains, the child who's killed by the first drug, and then the second used to expel the child's remains. But in 5 to 10% of cases, that doesn't happen completely. And in 1 to 3% of those 5 to 10%, 1.3%, 1 to 3% of the total number within that incomplete figure, there's an ongoing pregnancy, which means a woman then typically would have that surgically removed. Now, the timing of how this happens, the 2 drugs, so those who remember the earlier lecture on medical abortions will recall that there's a fairly critical pattern in which the drugs are to be used. RU486, the first one, mifepristone, is taken, that kills the child, and then between 24 and 48 hours later, a second drug is taken to expel the child's remains, and that can happen for a variable gestational ages. So a woman may be about 8 to 9 weeks pregnant, and a medical abortion takes place, and that can happen up to normally within the first trimester up to 13 weeks, but it varies from different legislatures what's permitted. Medical abortion can happen in the second trimester, but these early medical abortions are within the first trimester, And the risk of complications is directly related to the timing of those drugs with respect to each other, as well as with respect to the gestational age of the child. The higher the gestational age, the greater the risk of complications. And in the UK, of course, there have been recent changes to permit a medical abortion purely by telemedicine without any medical supervision. And I personally think that's enormously risky, because women are not always in a very strong position to determine gestational age, and under all sorts of influences at the time that they might take those drugs. So that can be directly have a direct effect on complication risk. Beyond the direct physical effects of an early medical abortion, the reality is that a woman will be often at home alone, experiencing the passing of her unborn child, the dead child. And that's described by many women to be quite traumatic. In one particular study, which is a qualitative study looking at women's experiences, women use these sorts of terminology. They spoke of agony, such a physical and emotional process. The day was absolutely horrific. I bled so much it's pouring out. In hindsight, I wished I hadn't looked, but I did. And that was probably the most traumatic thing I've ever seen or done. If my friend had been there and seen me screaming like that. And these are just some of those. Now, that's a pretty powerful psychological impact. And I don't think that we ought to, as some do, simply discount that part of the experience and how that may in fact be connected to later psychological trauma. There's also a large body of research, back to the physical effects, on abortion-related mortality. Now, this is work done at the population level, so it's not really saying that a death directly as a consequence of the abortion, but overall looking at the population level and looking at women who've had abortions and comparing them with women who haven't. And these are the sorts of elevated risks of death that have been found. And there's a 63% elevated risk from natural causes, a 324% increased risk of death from accidents, a 546% increased risk of death by suicide, and over 1,000% increased risk of death by homicide. So these are associations between mortality and abortion. And it clearly shows that for women who've had abortions, there are an enormous number of risks here that will potentially lead to their death, much greater than for other women in the community. There's also the Finns are very good at this sort of work, mainly because they have these huge databases and registers of everyone that's had an abortion, and then can match that confidentially with the outcomes. And they found that the risk, these are not percentage risks, but actual numbers per 100,000, that the risk of suicide after birth was the lowest, 5.9 per 100,000. And non-pregnant women is roughly double that. But for miscarriage, it's triple that. And after abortion, it's nearly 6 times that. So this is suicide risk. And so when we're talking about suicide risk, we are clearly talking about the psychological well-being of women. One other area in which there's been a considerable amount of research is the risk of a preterm birth in a subsequent pregnancy. So a woman's had an abortion, and it's thought that primarily the procedure during a surgical abortion, which involves stretching the cervix, can lead to damage to the cervix. So in a subsequent pregnancy, that means that the child would be born prematurely. Now, premature births are a serious matter. The definition of a premature birth is before 37 weeks, the normal being 40, and for a very preterm, before 32 weeks. And there are a range of health problems that can arise from those, particularly the very, very preterm births. So the damage to the cervix is likely to be the main reason, but it's also possible that in a medical abortion, the damage that can occur from infection and maybe other things could also have an impact on subsequent preterm births. But at this stage, the research is too limited to tell. No one's really sure. Breast cancer. This is one of those areas which is hugely disputed. And you'll find a whole range of papers which say there is a link, that abortion is actually not only associated but causative. Some particular researchers have come up with a model as to why they think that happens, what the actual mechanism is. And there are others who state there's no association at all. So the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists say there's none. But in contrast, the American College of Pediatricians says there is a risk. So it's wholly disputed. What's really interesting about this research is that one thing that's clear is that breast cancer risk is reduced by carrying a child to term. So what that means is that if a woman presents seeking an abortion, the two outcomes before her are the abortion or carrying the child to term. And the research is clear that the breast cancer risk is reduced by carrying to term. So for her, at that point of decision making, one option has a higher risk than another, and that higher risk option is to have the abortion. So it's my view that this is something which is badly lacking in the informed consent process, and certainly should be part of the informed consent, that the woman should be aware of that. I've covered that. Now, probably another area which is even more contested is the question of infertility. Now, the difficulty here is that whilst with, say, breast cancer or preterm birth, there is quite a bit of reasonable research. In this area, there's very, very little. However, what's really interesting is that, first of all, various groups, advocacy groups and providers and government have all declared that abortion has no impact on fertility. But I do think that that's jumping the gun, and there's a particular reason for this. Because there is good research which shows that an abortion can lead to a range of adverse outcomes, namely cervical damage, as we discussed for the preterm, pelvic inflammatory disease, intrauterine adhesions, and endometrial thinning. So that's research which people will agree and accept is a consequence of abortion. Then what's interesting, in quite separate, unconnected research, is that each of those things has been linked to infertility. So there are well-established theoretical grounds to establish a pathway from abortion through to infertility. But because the research is so poor, we can't be conclusive. And some of the research which has gone down a slightly different path and looked in total at the levels of infertility amongst post-abortal women is in dispute. Different studies come up with different things. And I think this is such an important issue that it really should be studied properly. Okay, so let's turn now to the psychological impact of abortion. And as is often the case, anecdotal evidence can kick off the need to do proper constructed research so that we can find out, not only the qualitative nature of the effect on women's psychology, on particular mental health problems, but also the quantitative to find out how many women are affected, what sort of levels of risk we're talking about, and so on. But one thing this anecdotal evidence is really clear. You only need to talk to counsellors, and they'll say they have many women who come to them who describe their abortion as a traumatic and life-changing event, and ascribe their mental health struggles directly to the abortion. So that's quite strong anecdotal evidence. And that might be for a defined order that is clinically diagnosed, like depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder or substance abuse disorder. There are a range of possible adverse outcomes. But it's worth keeping in mind that the impact can also have personal psychological consequences that do not rise to the level of a clinically diagnosed mental health disorder, but are nevertheless significantly distressing for women as they reflect back upon their abortions. And I think for some, particularly, the question of having been coerced and pressured into that abortion is one that has probably made the mental health outcome more problematic. And in fact, there is some evidence to show that when there was coercion, pressure involved, that was indeed the case. So why, I'm just going to sidestep for a moment and argue really that this is particularly important, the psychological impact of abortion, and in a way it explains why there is a large body of research interest in this area, a huge body of interest in this area. So in the UK, an abortion under one particular ground C, would be permitted if the continuance of the pregnancy would involve risk greater than if the pregnancy were terminated of injury to the physical or mental health of the pregnant woman. In other words, if you were to get really technical about ground C, which about 98% of abortions in the UK happen under ground C for mental health reasons, if you were technical about applying that, you would have to say you could only allow an abortion if the abortion would lower a woman's chance of becoming physically or mentally unwell. Right? Lower. And it's clear, and everyone agrees, there is no evidence whatsoever that an abortion lowers a woman's mental risk of mental disorder. Having said that, when we come to the Turnaway study, that's the one study which seems to imply that, in fact, it could be the case that abortion would be better for a woman, but it stands out as in complete contrast to everything else. So it's an important issue. Again, if this ground C was strictly applied, 98% of abortions in the UK would have to stop. Now, the better studies look at large-scale health records. And so what they're able to do, often called linkage studies, they look at these large-scale health records and they can actually determine from those health records whether a woman has had an abortion and line up with her mental health outcomes or conduct some sort of study of the particular mental health outcomes. And those particularly big, large-scale, good studies, they adjust for what are often called confounders, like prior mental health. So someone might say, for example, that a woman who has a mental health problem after the abortion only has that because she had it before, or that she has adverse mental health outcomes because of socioeconomic factors, or she experienced pressure, or there was low self-esteem or poor support. So these quality studies work hard to isolate out abortion as the one thing being tested for, and they do come up with a clear impact of abortion on a woman's mental health. And so just taking the results of one particular researcher's work, Donald Sullins, I think it's Donald Sullins, in 2016, he came up with this sort of increased risk as a result of abortion. 30% increase in depression, 23% for anxiety, suicidal ideation 68%, which is clearly matches with that work I was talking about before. Alcohol abuse 110%, illicit drug abuse 225%. This business of substance abuse comes up as a pretty big finding across lots of different studies. There, I can think of at least 7 or 8 studies like Sullins. Ferguson was clearly another one. Reardon, Coleman, Luo, Jacob, and a whole range of others have done this sort of study, and they've been quite coherent and consistent in their findings. One thing which sort of hasn't been always included in the research is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in one particular review, it did look at 48 studies, found that PTSD was increased after abortion, but it was very hard to pin down any specific percentage risk. The other thing that researchers often do is they look at that increased level of risk of a mental health disorder and try and come up with what they term a population attributable risk. So what that means is how much of the mental health disorder in the community can we say might have come from women having abortions? And in Coleman's work, Sullivan's work, and others, the typical figures range from 5 to 15%, depending on the disorder. Another way of putting that is that between 5 and 15% of women in the community who have a given mental health problem acquired it as a result of abortion. And higher figures would be for substance abuse. So you can see the impact at the community level when that kind of figure is given. Now, I did mention before some of what are called particular risk factors for worse outcomes. So women who have felt pressured or certainly wanted the pregnancy or were ambivalent. And I should just pause for a minute and say that if a woman is feeling pressured, that in a sense implies that she wants the pregnancy. So the numerous studies that have showed that women have been pressured in quite significant numbers, and I'm reminded of the UK's BBC poll recently, which showed that those women who are pressured clearly wanted the pregnancy. So there are a lot of wanted pregnancies that end up being aborted. And as I mentioned before, women with prior mental health problems, a history of prior abortion, so multiple abortions are risk factors for worse outcomes, poor support, those who believed abortion to be morally wrong, which is kind of understandable. And so one thing that would be very sensible, which is not done as far as I'm aware, is that there ought to be a much more careful screening process to basically help women who have those prior conditions to be aware of what might then result in terms of their post-abortion psychological health. There's one particular set of circumstances in which the psychological impact after a particular sort of abortion is more agreed in the literature, I should say. And that's when there's been disability in the child. And in one particular study I'm thinking of, 4 months after the abortion, nearly 50% of the women had symptoms of PTSD and about 28% had depression. Those are huge numbers. The symptoms did decline in that particular study over the following year, but there are others that were conducted much longer and showed that the trauma was the same 4 years after as that experience after 14 days. So there are not a lot of abortions happening for disability in the child, but as a percentage of the overall number, but it still translates to a large number of women adversely affected. Now, we'll stay with the psychological impact of abortion. And one thing that I think is very problematic is that when peak bodies or sort of overarching bodies in a profession like the Royal College of Psychiatrists or the Royal College of Gynecologists and obstetricians and gynecologists, those sorts of peak bodies are the ones that doctors look to try and determine how they will deal with a particular issue. And so it's really unfortunate when some of the reviews conducted by those bodies have concluded that there's no link between abortion and adverse mental health outcomes. It's interesting that there's a Canadian researcher and psychologist, Dr. Philip Ney, he was invited, one of 10 participants, to be part of this National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health of the Royal College of Psychiatrists review conducted in 2011. And he gave a whole lot of views about his interpretation of the literature. And he was quite scathing of the NCCMH's review and described it as a maze of sophistry and deceit. And then he went on to say this review should not be taken very seriously, and the conclusion is not at all. Now, I think I can understand why this is so difficult, because we should be able to trust these peak bodies. They're the ones we turn to. And when they come up with a conclusion like this, which seems so at odds with the literature, we've got a real problem. And it's very hard to turn that around because people intuitively say, well, surely they're the ones we should trust. They're the ones who know. They're the ones at the top. And when they do this sort of thing, we've got a big, big problem. Here's one particular researcher, Priscilla Coleman. Some may be aware of her work. She's been in the area of abortion and psychological health for more than 30 years. And she made this statement about the field as a whole. She said there's a truly shameful and systematic bias that permeates the psychology of abortion. Professional organisations in the USA and elsewhere have arrogantly sought to distort the scientific literature and paternalistically deny women the information they deserve to make fully informed healthcare choices and receive necessary mental health counselling when and if an abortion decision proves detrimental. I think one of the really big problems here, which I think she's really getting at, is that a woman who has a mental health problem after her abortion and feels that it might be related to her abortion is reassured by all of these figures of authority that she's wrong. And yet she knows in her heart of hearts that it's disconnected. And so a huge disservice to her when she's struggling with a mental health problem and she's been told, well, you're wrong. So let's now look at let's turn to the Turnaway study. I mentioned this study at the outset as one that's been deeply problematic. And I should preface this by saying that I think there's been a real shift over the last 15 years in research in this area, but not only in this area, a bit more broadly. The relationship between the universities and industry and non-government organisations and sources of funding has shifted. And so in the Turnaway study, for example, we have a study funded almost entirely by an outside pro-abortion funding body. Now that's different than what you might call the old days of most funding coming from government or national research foundations and groups like that. These are individuals pushing a particular agenda who have infiltrated, in my view, the research enterprise and introduced work like this, which I think is damaging. So what was the Turnaway study? First of all, it's been hugely influential, and as I mentioned before, it's been taken up by media outlets. I think there are to date something like 50 papers published coming out of this study, and their major conclusion was there are no adverse mental health outcomes for women following abortion. In fact, there might be adverse outcomes, not only mental health but other ones, for women denied an abortion. So how was the study done? Well, there were three groups of women. The first were a group who had a first trimester abortion. The second were women who had an abortion just before the legal cutoff limit of a particular clinic. So these are US clinics. There are 30 odd clinics in part of the study. And in those clinics in different states, some will have legal cutoff limits of 10 weeks gestation, some will have 13, some 20, and so up to 27. So between 10 and 27 weeks of gestation, depending on the clinic, was the point that a woman could have an abortion, just up to that cutoff. And then the third group of women were those who came in and sought beyond the cutoff limit, 11 weeks for a particular clinic or 28 weeks for another clinic, and therefore they were turned away. So they were the turnaways. So this study is basically saying that the turnaways are the non-abortion group, and we're testing against the non-abortion group. And we're looking at women who've had a first trimester abortion or those who had an abortion just before the cutoff, and so at very similar times to the women who had them just after the cutoff. So why is this problematic? It's problematic initially on the grounds of what might be called selection bias. So there's a pool of over 100,000 women that the researchers could have accessed from the 30 clinics over the time period of the study. They initially screened 7,486. It's not entirely clear because it's not always explained in the papers how that screening process occurred. Then after screening, 3,000 women were approached. Now, they were approached by researchers trained by the National Abortion Federation, and 1,199 women agreed. Then out of those 1,199, 877 finally started the program, and at the 5-year interview, 516 were left. Now, the two problems are selection bias, and the other is the high dropout rate. So here we have 16.9% actually finished the study, which is extremely low for any study. But I think this is the unknown. The unknown is how that screening approach process was undertaken, and if researchers intuitively avoided the most distressed women in the abortion group, preferentially or differentially from the women in the turnaway group. And there are many critiques of the turnaway study which highlight this self-selection bias as one of the most significant problems in the research. Because if a significant number of women are self-selecting themselves out of the study, it's likely to be those who don't want anything to do with it because it raises the trauma for them again of the abortion. Just to give a quick example here of how this could work. Say, for example, a researcher asks 1,000 women who had an abortion to participate in the study. And then let's assume that 500 aborting women agree, so half of those 1,000 agree, and then the researchers find a matched group of 500 non-aborting women from somewhere else. So you've got 500 women who have aborted, 500 who have not, and this is what the study is based on. However, if only 10% of those 1,000 women who had the abortion had an adverse psychological reaction to it, they are the first to want to avoid participating in the study. They are the first who will say, I don't want anything to do with it because it's going to force them to revisit the distress. So that's going to badly skew that 500 group of women who've had an abortion, badly skew that sample to make it look like there's not much mental health problem in that group and compare with the non-aborting women. And so in the end, any genuine difference dilutes out. That's just one sort of possible way that could be problematic. But the turnaway group itself is a really odd group to use as a non-abortion group. What the researchers didn't say in most of their publications, and you had to dig for it, was that 25% of those women would then go on to have an abortion. So suddenly this turnaway group is really not a non-abortion comparison group at all. It's a comparison group that actually has a significant number of women who've had an abortion. And so it's going to really muddy the waters. The study also specifically excluded women who'd had abortions for disability, a category for which we know there are mental health problems which are more acute. And of course, if they were included, that would have made a potential difference stand out more. Also, the researchers used poor quality measures for the different types of mental health conditions they sought to assess. Some of them were just very simplistic when there are a large number of very high quality measures, what are called instruments, to study depression and anxiety, for example. And so the problem with using a simplistic measure is you will miss a diagnosis of depression or miss a diagnosis of anxiety. The other thing which is pretty disturbing is that the researchers often published in journals that require as a condition of publication that the data be shared. And typically what happens with this sort of data is researchers are able to de-identify it, take the names off and just treat it as pure data. So no woman can be actually traced, so there are no privacy issues involved. And this happens through all sorts of social science research where data is made available. I used to work in the research integrity area, and one of the requirements of research integrity is a openness to the sharing of data when it's possible for it to be done. Most of the time it is possible for it to be done. And so the researchers have persistently refused to share their data so that other researchers have got no way of cross-checking the outcomes of the research. One researcher, David Reardon, has written about the Turnaway saga, and he's highlighted something which I think is really deeply problematic. When the journals themselves have accepted work of this nature, which is clearly subpar, then it's a real problem, because it gets published and then it looks like a legitimate study. The authors can say all their outcomes have passed peer review, and then the media are sent talking points and widely report that this is the final word on abortion and mental health. It's certainly not. David Reardon made this comment: all of the Turnaway studies are based on such a weak and biased data set that the real news story is how these studies managed to be published, much less how they became elevated to headline news. Clearly, the complicit medical journals and peer reviewers were so anxious to provide a platform for pro-abortion propaganda that they not only ignored the poor methodology and superficial analyses, but also gave the authors free rein to publish exaggerated conclusions that went far beyond the evidence that they had presented. So that's a pretty targeted and scathing comment. I should add that David Reardon is a researcher who's been working in this area for a long time, and wrote recently, in 2018, I think it was, a paper which was about as even-handed as you could possibly get, analysis of the field, to try and get people to agree on what we could agree upon based on a lot of the literature. And of course, he had no choice but to comment on the Turnaway study, which he did extensively. Coleman has also commented on it, and you'll find, anyone who's interested, you can just simply Google Turnaway critique and you'll find two excellent papers by David Reardon and Priscilla Coleman that analyse the particular problems with this research. Okay, so that's me for this so far, and I'm really happy now to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. So we do have a number of questions. And the first one is, what percentage of studies currently out there on abortion do you think are compromised by an ideological bias? What percentage?
I think my thinking is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 20%, and it's not a lot. But what counts more than anything is the influence that those particular ones have by the way they're taken up by media and promoted by other bodies. It's extraordinary what the power of major media outlets. When I anecdotally just talk to acquaintances about this matter, they'll say, "Oh, well, the New Yorker published this," or "Oh, CBC published this," or "NBC published that," or "the ABC published this," and they said it's all done and dusted and it's not an issue anymore. So it's clearly influential for a lot of people when they see those things, those media outlets reporting like that. But having said that, there's a lot of good research. It's just getting it to prominence. 80% or more is good research.
Thanks, Greg. Here's another one about breast cancer. The questioner says pro-lifers have been accused of lying about the causal link between abortion and breast cancer. Are these accusations more likely to be due to strictly scientific controversy, or are they a tactic of the abortion lobby?
That's a really hard one to answer, because one thing about the abortion and breast cancer link is that breast cancer itself has an enormous list of risk factors. There are such a large list of risk factors that to do the research itself is very tricky to isolate out an abortion. Issues like selection bias or poor reporting of abortion, to actually get to the data is hard. So it's true that scientifically it's difficult. And there are publications which have come out on both sides. But on top of that, I think because this whole field is so ideologically charged and politically charged, that's infiltrated as well. So it's in really a bit of each, I think. I would really hope that something gets clinched in the next 5 to 10 years here, because I think there's a link from the papers that I've seen. And I know there are researchers who are absolutely convinced that the better quality studies do show that there's a link. But what's particularly interesting is that the potential physiological mechanism for that to happen has been identified by some researchers. So when you've got a feasible, believable, and sensible physiological pathway that could go from abortion, it's in terms of maturation of the breast milk globules and so on. Once you've got that in place, that makes it far more likely that there will be a link, because there's a mechanism that's been explained.
Could I just ask a further question on that same point that occurs to me? You're very careful with your words, Greg, because that's your profession, to be accurate. So the questioner talked about a cause, and you spoke about a link.
Yes, yeah.
Could you comment on the different usage there?
Okay. I think that the two key terms are association and cause. So to actually determine a cause of something scientifically is much harder to prove that there's a cause. So if we think, for example, about tobacco and lung cancer, that took about 60 years of studies, which were first started out as an association between. We could see that there's some sort of link. So we use the word link, like association. So there's some sort of link. But how do we get to the point of proving that smoking actually causes lung cancer? Because you can't get a whole bunch of people and say, you're going to be the smokers, and another bunch of people and say, you're not, and we're going to follow you through time. It's one of those human behavioral things that you can't, because that's how studies are normally done to determine cause, is you have two groups and you control it. You can't do that with tobacco smoking, and you can't do it with abortion, because you can't control people's behavior. So you have to look at association and then work through a whole range of techniques and methods to get closer to being a causative link. And that's the trickier part. So we've got association. Causation comes after much more work. And I think that's I would think that with the breast cancer thing, that's probably going to emerge over time.
So the question, I suppose, at the heart of my previous question was, is it more prudent for people seeking to present a reasonable case against abortion to a skeptical world to talk about a link rather than a cause?
I think it's certainly at this point of time probably fairer to talk about an association rather than a cause. Now, I know straight away that there'll be researchers on the breast cancer story who'll say they've got enough evidence for a cause. These things take a while to get consensus in a community of researchers. So there will be some who'll say that they think it's causative, and others who'll say, who'll be more cautious. So researchers are like anyone else. They're different in their interpretation of things and their public statements.
Okay, so, well, moving away from cancer, if abortion, the next questioner asks this, if abortion is known to cause damage and disease, which are in turn known to cause infertility, can there still be reasonable doubt as to an overarching link?
I personally don't think so. I don't think there can be reasonable doubt. I just think the studies haven't been done. They haven't been done properly. And I think this is one of those things that people think has been done and dusted. They know the research is particularly hard to do. If there's no funding for it, then no one's going to do it. So it comes often down to a funding problem. I think it's because what you just described, I think there will be proven to be an impact of abortion on infertility that's probably more significant than anyone's made out because of those quite strong links along the pathway. If you like, it's an explanatory mechanism is in place already. So I think eventually.
Thank you. So quite a few questions here, Greg, but you're answering very clearly and concisely. Is the subject of a scientific study usually chosen in order to investigate anecdotal evidence, for example, on the consequences of abortion on women's mental health?
I think that's sometimes a trigger, but it's often the case in social science research that something pops up anecdotally and people say, well, hang on, I keep seeing this or I keep seeing that. And then someone says, well, that needs to be studied. The problem then comes with who's going to fund that study. And if there are political forces involved who do not want certain research to happen, it won't happen. Likewise, and this goes back to the Turnaway study, if there are private funders with massive amounts of money, and the figure was 88 million provided to the Turnaway group by Warren Buffett, that's a huge amount of money, and a private funding body can sway a research field in a very significant way by doing that. So yes, anecdotal stuff sometimes kicks things off, but governments should be looking for gaps in the research. They should be listening to researchers saying, there's something here about infertility and abortion. It needs to be studied. And it's only when researchers can get the funding that they can do the work.
Okay, so, right, a question just come in from one of our participants again here. Maybe you could give a general comment on this. What is the link between the biased researchers, their promoters among the scientific journals, and lawmakers?
Oh, gee. That's an investigative journalist question.
Yes.
I don't really know, although I always think it's fair to consider money, because if you look at RU486, for example, which is the abortion pill, it's a pharmaceutical product worth billions to the manufacturers. And so, and we know this from, there's plenty of research about the contamination of research by pharmaceutical interests. And I think that's following the money is always worth thinking about. And I do think that when you've got something taken by huge numbers of women regularly, it's a very valuable product. And so to a certain extent, there can be, not so much with the scientific journals, I don't think, but possibly with lawmakers and promoters. And, there are certainly connections between the manufacturers of RU486 and the research community. I know that. So that's a conflict of interest.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you. This is an interesting question now, and again, it's a challenging one. Have there been any efforts made to take what our questioner calls insincere researchers and journals before ethics courts? Well,
well, I didn't know there was an ethics court, but I suppose, that's a really good question, and I don't know of any real effort to try and expose. I'm sort of I'm bumbling along because I'm thinking of the way this would be done. One of the potential pathways, and this does happen, is that universities have research integrity departments. And if someone makes a complaint, the universities are obliged to investigate. And so an ethics court, I suppose, could be said to be a university in research integrity department, and I personally have been involved in some investigations of researchers who've done the wrong thing. But the done the wrong thing is across a whole range of possible things like plagiarism and other things like that. Getting into what we're talking about here is a much more comprehensive and difficult thing. It goes beyond individual researchers, unless it can be shown, for example, there's a real clear conflict of interest and researchers have acted contrary to the integrity of the university's research, then yes, that could result in some sort of ethics court punishment.
Thank you. Right, another question just in. Can you say more about the association between abortion and death by homicide?
No, look, I can't. I think it would be pure speculation if I did. If the only sort of speculative thing I would say is that, to a certain extent, some sectors of the community in which there is a higher incidence of abortion, maybe in domestic violence type settings, or we know there's a link between. We certainly know there's a link between intimate partner violence and abortion. We know that. So because of that link, I suppose there's a risk of homicide that'd be higher in that kind of IPV setting, but also in the link between abortion and sex trafficking. That's a well-established link too, and that's a pretty nefarious industry. And so the risk of homicide, I suspect, would be higher there as well.
Thanks, Greg. Right. Yet another question. Why do you think informed consent for women with greater risk factors is not emphasized in so-called abortion care?
I think there's possibly a couple of reasons for that. One is it's too hard for doctors to sort of go through and do properly. I don't think it is too hard, but that's what some pressured doctors in circumstances that. So if you take, for example, the abortion providers, there's been quite a bit written about how they're an industry which has a high throughput rate, and they really just want to get women through. That's a kind of setting where there might not be a real and genuine interest in trying to find out whether there's a woman with a particular risk factor. It's too hard for some to do. My personal view is that, and I think it's just going to be my personal view, is that doctors who are prepared to do abortions are probably somewhat morally, well, not somewhat, morally compromised already, and they're likely to carry over that moral compromise into other things like genuine care for the woman.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. We may have to make this next one the last one, I think, with apologies to other questioners that have sent in questions, but there we are. Time rushes on. Do you think that a high-profile exposure of compromised research, such as the Turnaway study, is likely? And what effect do you think that such an exposure might have?
Depends how profile exposure we're talking about. So I did mention that both Priscilla Coleman and David Reardon had written excellent critiques. It's a matter of getting that to a higher exposure level. There's another problem though. I think it goes a bit deeper. I think there's a problem with evidence, the importance of evidence. Sometimes politicians, in particular, do not want to listen to the evidence. You can put all the evidence you like before them. You can say, it's so clear, so strong, but then people will go, oh, I'll just decide on other grounds. So sometimes ideology and political interest, as we know in other areas too, can trump evidence. And I think particularly in a postmodern context, the importance of evidence has declined a little. And I think that's really problematic. So ideology has risen more to the fore and evidence has been pushed more to the back. Although, fascinatingly, the whole thing about the Turnaway was, hey, look, we've got all this evidence. and it was publicised and it was used to to sway a lot of people.
Well, thanks, Greg, for guiding us through all of these issues. I think everyone will have learned a great deal for this. The time's up. And thank you, everyone, for your participation today. The video of this lesson will be made available on the Family and Life Academy website, along with study notes and other resources. We look forward to seeing you for lesson 6, which is the last lesson of the abortion course. I shall be the presenter, and my topic is historic events and key figures in the history of legalized abortion. And do, by the way, look out for other courses and webinars which are available through the Family and Life Academy. So thank you again, Dr. Pike.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing all of you next time for lesson 6. Thank you.